Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Hormonal Fluctuations and ADHD, How Estrogen May Impact Symptoms Throughout Life. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Jeanette Wasserstein. Dr. Wasserstein is a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. She's a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist who has spent the last 20 years specializing in the diagnosis, research, and treatment of adults with ADHD. You can visit her website at cnsupport.com to learn more. Brain fog, short-term memory, poor time management, these are all associated with perimenopause and menopause. They're also associated with ADHD. A clear link does not yet exist, but research indicates that shifting hormones do influence the ADHD brain and can worsen or even mimic symptoms. Today, we will share new findings published with some help from Attitude and ways you can lessen the impact of hormonal changes across life. To give us a sense of who is here, we'd like to begin today's webinar by asking a few poll questions to our live audience. We would love to know, at what age did you receive your ADHD diagnosis? And have you noticed changes in cognitive function or mood that correspond to your hormonal fluctuations or changes? And you can tell us what you noticed. And then this final question I think is really important. Do you feel heard? How would you rate the care that you've received for these health concerns so far? While you spend some time selecting your answers and commenting, I will mention that if you have any common questions about our slides, transcripts, certificates of attendance, you can find those in the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, you're going to visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast 484 to access the webinar resources. You can also click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. And if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Right now, we have a special holiday 2-for-1 offer. You can get a subscription for yourself and another one for free for someone who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Just click the magazine tab on your screen to learn more. Okay, without any further ado, Dr. Wasserstein, thank you so much for being here today and for leading this really important and not enough discussed topic.
It's absolutely not enough discussed. When I was doing a research in the literature, people were first drawing attention to this issue back in the 90s. And I hate to say it, but since then, there's been so little research. And I mean, so little research, like I could count it on stuff directly related to ADD in women, 2 hands. I mean, outrageously little research. Anyway, there have been important clinical observations, as you see on the screen in front of you. First of all, people noticed that ADHD symptoms seem to increase shortly before the period, when by correlation, estrogen and progesterone drop. Also, ADHD symptoms seem to decrease during pregnancy when both estrogen and progesterone increase dramatically. CNS stimulants seem to have different therapeutic effects depending on where in the cycle, seemingly fluctuating with estrogen levels. And studies report high levels of cognitive complaints during perimenopause, which we're going to go more into in today's talk, when hormones fluctuate. Move us forward. Some important, very important scientific underpinnings to the connection between hormones and cognitive functioning. First of all, estrogens elevate levels of neurotransmitters, the chemicals that help neurons talk to each other, such as serotonin and acetylcholine. Serotonin is very important for mood regulation, and acetylcholine is very important for memory. You've heard of SSRIs, that means serotonin reuptake inhibitors, basically increasing the level of serotonin. And you've heard of Aricept for dementia. That's an anticholinesterase, meaning it stops the brain from breaking down acetylcholine. So taking us back to the estrogen, it increases the levels of both of these very important neurotransmitters. I'm sorry, I have to tell you in the front, there's a lot of science in today's talk, and I will try and deliver it in a user-friendly way. But it's essential to cover this field in order to understand the connection between hormones, cognition, and ADD. Estrogens, back to the hormones, the principal one, estrogens promote neuronal growth, and they promote the formation of synapses. So they're important for what's called neuroplasticity. Estrogen acts as an antioxidant. So antioxidants protect everything in the body, and so they're important for neural protection. Estrogens have regulatory effects on calcium homeostasis, and they act as secondary messengers. Basically, what that's saying is estrogens are very important in the physiology, in the actual action of the brain. And different ERS polymorphisms, that means different genes for estrogen receptors, have been associated with differential risk for ADHD. Wild. It's a very recent study, and only one study has actually shown that different estrogen receptor gene types can predispose to ADHD, but only in those who are also at risk for substance abuse in rats. So that's how new this research is. It's recent and it's only in animals. Take a long time before we get to humans. But the bottom line is it's saying that genes for different estrogens can increase the risk for a subset of ADD. An overview of today's talk, where this outline is not exactly the way I'm going to cover it. We're going to review and expand discussion of hormones. We're going to present some of the new findings that we collected with the help of attitude survey responders. We're going to consider other related issues, and this one is very interesting. We're going to consider treatments, possibilities, and future directions. All right. Okay, moving to some highlights from the previous webinar. Let's get me moving there. Basically, it's hormones again. Last time we talked about the hormone fluctuations during the climactic years. That means during the years when our body climate is changing, and it's really referring to when we're going from menopause to perimenopause when we're going to regular, healthy menstrual cycles to perimenstrual when we're beginning to change into menopause. And as you can see, all those, it's on the right, all those lines, it's estrogen, progesterone, follicle stimulating hormone, which is the FSH, and luteinizing hormone, which is the LH. All of them are, and at the bottom you can see age. We're going from 35 to 75. You can see they're all going down. That's what we talked about last time. This time, we're going to be talking more about the menstrual cycle. And you can see you have the pink part, which is estrogen, the yellow part, which is progesterone, and there's an overlap. Basically, what this is showing is in the course of the days of the menstrual cycle early on, it's increasing, the estrogen is increasing, and the progesterone is low. And then you get to the ovulation. Does my pointer show up where? I guess not. So you'll just have to use my words. Where the pink is peaking is where ovulation is happening, and then the estrogen falls off dramatically, and the progesterone starts increasing, And the estrogen kind of does some bumps along the way and has different functions. But the overall picture is estrogen is big and increasing in the beginning of the cycle and drops off radically with ovulation. And then the progesterone increases until it drops off, and then they're both gone, and then we have our period. So that's the focus of today's talk. Prior to menstruation, there have been some minimal connections between fluctuations in ADD. In the follicular phase, which is the period when estrogen levels are steadily increasing, ADHD symptoms are at their lowest. And that's the period when estrogen and progesterone are jointly protective. They work together. There is some evidence that ADHD women may be more responsive to stimulants during this period. There's actually studies that say that women experience stimulants as more stimulating during this period. In the luteal phase, the last 2 weeks, progesterone is initially increasing while the estrogen is decreasing, and ADHD symptoms increase. And this seems to be more likely to happen in high impulsivity women. Excuse me, I'm just going to try and monitor our time because I want to make sure we get through everything. Okay. And premenstrual syndrome is worse, especially for NT stands for neurotypical females. And there may also be decreasing effectiveness of ADHD medications in this period. But I tell you up front, there's no research on this, or very little. This is anecdotal. Besides estrogen, there are other sex hormones involved. There's follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, and testosterone. Not going to go into all of these. I just want to let you know how complicated it is. Changes in response to ADHD medications likely reflect the point in the menstrual cycle that a woman is and where all these different hormones are. And there's some evidence that impulsive, hyperactive, and there might be different reactions depending on which presentation of ADHD the person has. This is just another picture that, if you can look at it more closely, shows all the shifting levels of all the sex hormones at different points in the cycle. So you can see there's a lot of fluctuation in a lot of things. I think we just went a little bit too far. Yeah, okay, no, it is actually not too far. And then there are other considerations. Even against the backdrop of all these hormonal shifts in a given person, there's huge individual differences in the response to the hormone fluctuations. Some function very well despite them, and others are devastated. There are different types of estrogens that people use in hormone replacement, and this is a real biggie. I don't know how many of you heard of the Women's Health Initiative study, which led to a lot of women coming off of hormone replacement. Well, they used horse estrogen, and they used not progesterone, but a progestin, meaning it's a synthetic progesterone that's not exactly the same. And how different it is can be shown by the fact that progesterone, the natural stuff, supports pregnancy, whereas progestins cause abortion. So we're talking different animals. So it's important to know that there are different estrogens, what's called bioidentical, versus animal, literally taken from animals. And there's also different types of estrogen receptors. Remember, I told you in the beginning of this talk that there's some animal research that's just come out that shows that depending on the genetic makeup of some estrogen receptors, there's a differential predisposition for ADHD in rats, not people yet. But that just talks about the importance of points to the importance of estrogen receptors. Hope I'm not losing you guys with all the science. I'm trying to make it user-friendly. There's also something called a critical window of time, or tissue health, meaning if you're thinking about estrogen replacement, you can't just do it at any point in time. It's got to be in a critical window of time, because if it's given after that critical window of time, it can cause brain death. So it's touchy. There may be relevant ratios of hormones rather than absolute levels. So there may be something called the estrogen-progesterone ratio. So it's not how much estrogen you have or how much progesterone you have, but rather how much you have relative to the other. A lot to be worked out in the research. And then the responses to hormone replacement that I was just talking about might mirror all these complications. So it's very complicated. No research existed relevant to the changes in ADHD symptoms in adult women across the lifespan. Several studies looked at the response to stimulants or Strattera for women with late-onset executive functions, but nothing directly with women who were diagnosed with ADHD. What's important, they did find improvement on executive function scales for these women that developed the executive function problems in midlife. No study examined the direct relationship, but we did with the help of, Attitude Magazine and the community of the readership. So I'm going to share with you guys some of our findings. Now we've presented, my collaborators are Jerry Stephanatis and Mary Salanto, and we've presented this research at a number of places, at posters. Once we presented it at APSAR last year, and we presented it here in Taiwan. I am in Asia right now. We presented it in Taiwan this summer. The information came from the reader survey sponsored by Attitude Magazine, and the responses were received from 3,549 women who had experienced perimenopause or menopause, and of whom 81% had been diagnosed with ADHD. So a lot of ADHD women. Clinical care. Excuse me for a moment, guys. I'm having trouble reading the small thing, so I'm going to put this up close. Actually, I need to get my glasses. My apologies. It'll take a moment because I think it's important. It's important for me to read these what's called busy slides. Okay, I'm back. All right. So the first one is looking at what type of ADHD the people had, and you can see that most of them were combined type, but inattentive type was a large percentage. Most women with ADD, adults with are inattentive, so this population is a little bit skewed towards combined type for whatever reason. But if you look at the comorbid diagnoses, unfortunately, these ladies shared what's out in the world, a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression. Those were the most common comorbid conditions. And then there's a little bit of everything else. We focused on likely estrogen loss over the lifespan. As you can see this slide is showing what happens as estrogen fluctuates over the lifespan and depression. And ironically, depression increases as the estrogen increases, and decreases in the perimenopausal years and the postmenopausal phase when estrogen falls off. We're not talking about that today, but it's just interesting. We did the same, though, with the diagnosis of ADHD. We found a similar pattern for age at first diagnosis of ADHD, but it was most pronounced for perimenopause. Let me explain this figure for those of you who are not familiar with looking at figures. The red line is the rate of the number of participants who were diagnosed with ADHD for the first time. And you can see on the bottom, age of onset, that's at what age. And you can see that there's a cluster. The greatest number of first-time diagnoses in women was between 41 and 55. Those are the perimenopause, menopausal years. Then we broke it apart by women who said they were perimenopausal during those years and those who said that they were menopausal during those years. So it's very odd, but it looks like the first diagnosis of ADHD occurred during this period, but it was more likely to happen during perimenopause than menopause. So something is happening during perimenopause that increases the likelihood of women either looking ADHD for the first time, or their ADHD is getting worse, or they were borderline ADHD and it puts them over the border. I just wanted to draw your attention again to the hormonal backdrop. And you can see during perimenopause, the red line is just estrogen. You can see how it increases from childhood to the years of, being a woman functioning in your fertile years. And then perimenopause, the estrogen is all over the place and then drops off with menopause. So maybe something about those estrogen fluctuations during perimenopause causes that increased presentation of ADHD or the ADHD type picture. Then it was interesting, we looked at the kind of symptoms that appeared at perimenopause and menopause. And you can see that the one that was the biggest thing that appeared for the first time during this period was brain fog, whatever that means. We're actually looking at that. There's a whole literature on the meaning of brain fog. But that's what women called brain fog, and memory issues seem to appear for the first time during this period. Also, with high frequency, was feeling overwhelmed. No surprise, if your brain is foggy, you're going to feel overwhelmed. Emotional dysregulation, also no surprise, because you're not thinking optimally and you're feeling overwhelmed. So, of course, you're upset. This is what we really call a busy slide, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. But basically, we have three clusters. All the way to the left, we have ages 20 to 39, I think. In the middle is ages 40 to 59, and after that, over 60 and up. And it's color-coded. Just pay attention to the greens, because this is all the same symptoms. We look at them at the youngest group, the middle group, and the oldest group. The green is at what point were the symptoms the worst, had most impact in your life. First of all, you can see that all of the symptoms had their most impact from 40 to 59. So that's when everybody felt their symptoms the most. And the specific symptoms were brain fog, inattention, overwhelm, executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, and social struggles worsened the most during this period. This is the proverbial busy slide. The impact of ADHD over age. When did the ADHD have the greatest impact on your daily life? That's all the way to the left. Those are the questions that people were asked. And the other one is, did you notice a difference in the severity of some ADHD symptoms during perimenopause and menopause? So you can see all the women said that not all, the majority, the biggest percentage, 60% of the women said that ADHD had the biggest impact in their daily life from 40 to 59. And huge, 90% said that the severity of their ADHD symptoms worsened during this period. I want to pause for a moment and talk a little bit scientese. This is what's called a selective sample. The women who answered the questions probably were more pulled towards women who were more interested in problems associated with ADHD and menopause. So we can't generalize. We can't talk about all women with ADHD, but rather the women who were concerned about the effect of menopause and their ADHD as they got older. So it's probably not as strong as these findings, but the findings are real. Hormone replacement therapy. That was a great question that the Attitude editors asked you guys, because they wanted to know, first, were any of them taking hormone replacement, or had they? So about a third had or were. And of those, how did it affect them? Did it make the ADHD symptoms get better? Did it make the symptoms get worse? they make no difference. And a substantial percentage, it improved. Hold on, having a little problem here that I will undo in a moment. Okay. So that's interesting. Not all women benefited from hormone replacement, but a significant percentage did. And the question is why and which and how. Okay, there are multiple other points in the lifespan during which hormones fluctuate and may impact ADHD. Of course, puberty, but there's no data regarding ADHD and puberty. Menstrual cycle, I've already talked about it above. Pregnancy and postpartum, no data regarding ADHD and how it fluctuates with those so important periods. And then post-climactic, the only data that I know exists is what we just showed you. There are other hormones that fluctuate and may impact the presentations of ADHD, and they can lead to something called ADHD mimics. Testosterone can fluctuate and lead to hyperactivity and impulsivity. Thyroid hormone can fluctuate and lead to inattention and poor concentration. ADHD mimics or medical mimics is an important construct to know about. There are medical conditions out there that can lead to a picture that looks like ADHD but isn't ADHD. So that's important to know. Okay. There are other what's called moderating considerations that may affect our understanding of how hormones affect ADHD. For example, this was given to me by an Attitude reader who sent me the information. Most of the graphs that show fluctuations in estrogen and fluctuations in progesterone look like the one on the left. But actually, the reality is that the units of measurement for estrogen and the units of measurement for progesterone are different. And if you correct for that, the differences between estrogen and progesterone look more like the graph on the right. And then that affects the thing that I talked about, the estrogen-progesterone ratio. The ratios are very different on the left than they are on the right. Research hasn't looked at that, but eventually, I hope it does. I'm sure it will, but it's just a question of when. Treatment options, that's a very important consideration. I'm sure everybody's thinking about that. Of course, there are the medical conditions, medical interventions, but there need to be modifiers. We have the usual array of stimulants for ADHD symptoms, stimulants, whatever category Strattera falls into, the stimulant family and that family, and they're developing new things all the time. But the problem is that all of these medicines need to be mindful, the administration of these medicines need to be mindful of changes in the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, postpartum. We're not there yet. It's hard enough to study these drugs in men who are not menstruating. Studying their effect on women whose hormones are fluctuating, and we just went through all those fluctuations, is very difficult, but it must happen. And another thing to consider is hormone stabilization or hormone replacement. For example, women who are having a lot of girls, young women who are having a lot of difficulty adjusting their medications, for them it might make sense to put them on birth control pills that stabilize the fluctuations somewhat. In women who are perimenopausal or menopausal, you might want to consider hormone replacement, but with the caveat that it should only be what's called bioidentical substances. The problem is that most psychiatrists are unfamiliar with and therefore reluctant to work with hormones. Paradoxically, GYNs are actually the people that are doing studies, research, and who are actually doing hormone replacement in women. But they don't work very much with mood regulation and cognitive functioning. So clearly, there needs to be ultimately a collaboration with a GYN and a psychiatrist in optimal treatment of women who are having difficulties. I mean, if you're doing well, there's no need for this. But if you're having difficulties, I would seek it now to the extent you can. And in the long term, I hope psychiatrists seek out GYN doctors and work out a collaboration. And then antidepressants and anxiolytic, as indicated. Remember the chart in the very beginning that I showed you about the high rate of depression and anxiety in women with ADHD, at all ages, but especially in the perimenopausal, menopausal years. So antidepressants, anxiolytics. So briefly summarize the medical stuff, the usual array, while mindful of the menstrual cycle where people are in their lifespan, or hormone stabilization, and ideally collaboration with a GYN and a psychiatrist where things are going badly, not where things are fine, but where they're going badly, and of course the antidepressants and the anxiolytics. Let's move into the complementary options, because those are the ones that I find particularly exciting. Omega-3 fatty acids. There's a research that's showing that especially if you have prescription level doses of these fatty acids, there's evidence that they might be helpful for ADHD. Why not for women in the perimenopausal years or the menopausal years? Zinc, iron, magnesium. There's research that can be helpful. Exercise, especially aerobic. Meditation or mindfulness exercises. There's a caveat here. A lot of people with ADHD have trouble sitting still and doing the clear your mind type of exercise. That's why active meditation and mindfulness exercises can be a way to go. So Tai Chi or yoga can be helpful for those who can't clear their mind and need to move. I can't clear my mind and I need to move, and I love Tai Chi, for example. Remediation for executive dysfunction. The coaches are good. Metacognitive CBT. There's a lot of work in that area where CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy for executive functioning, and then planners, time management, those sorts of things, and supportive psychotherapy. Because remember, I showed you that emotional dysregulation becomes particularly pronounced during these years. And then natural supplements. I think this is really interesting. There's something called phytohormones. That means they're hormones that are created by plants that are structurally similar to the hormones created by animals, people, horses, whatever. And they're called phyto. So there are phytoprogesterone formulations. It comes from wild yam, and it's available in cream form. There are phytoestrogens, and they come from soy. So tofu, edamame, milk. I love tofu pudding. I recommend it highly. And an interesting aside is that not that there's less ADD in Asia. I have not found that to be the case, and statistics are not that. But there's less breast cancer, which is a concern, because when you think about estrogen supplements, a lot of women can't. Postmenopausal women or perimenopausal women cannot take estrogens because they have what's called estrogen-sensitive breast cancer. There used to be a concern about estrogen increasing cancer in women who don't have it yet. There's new research coming that it's not the case, or may not be the case, but certainly for women with estrogen-sensitive breast cancer, they can't do hormone replacement, but they can eat a lot of soy, black cohosh, primrose, beans, licorice roots, oranges, tea, angelica, chaste, tea berry, and red clover. Broccoli. Eat a lot of broccoli. Eat a lot of carrots. Drink a lot of coffee. So there are a lot of sources of phytoestrogens that can supplement or compensate, or maybe compensate for the estrogen fall off during those years, and maybe even out the estrogen fluctuations during the cycle. And then there are more psychoactive supplements: ginseng for depression and sleep, 5-HTP for sleep and anxiety, kava for anxiety. Concern with that is it can cause liver toxicity. So might be a good idea, if you're interested in using natural supplements, to consult with a naturopath. They can be amazing in their ability to evaluate what's going on hormonally and otherwise, and come up with interventions with supplements and such that might give you a lot of relief. Future directions. We need recognition that hormones and cognition is an important issue in women's health. There isn't, I'm telling you, folks, the literature is so sparse. We need more research regarding the impact of sex hormones on women's psychology in general, ADHD or not, and during all stages of life: puberty, menstrual cycle, pregnancy, postpartum, and the climactic. There might be other stages, but those are the ones I know about. And we need collaboration between psychiatry and GYN regarding optimizing medical management of ADHD in females. I think we've hit L. And I guess we're open for questions now. I'm just checking how much time. Looks like we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Yes.
So
yes. Thank you, Dr. Wasserstein. We have so many really amazing questions today. I will do my best to get through them. I did want to just kick off the Q&A session by looking back at those survey questions that we asked at the outset. We asked people at what age they had been diagnosed. And I guess, unsurprisingly, more than half of people here today were diagnosed in midlife, between the ages of 35 and 64. Have you noticed changes in cognitive function or mood to correspond with hormonal fluctuations? 98% of people said yes. And they're pretty much in a dead heat here, with changes in focus and attention being the most common, just barely. The other options being increased forgetfulness, mood swings or emotional fluctuations, and then differences in energy levels. So it seems that those all four are quite prevalent. And the last question was, on a scale of 1 being poor to 5 being excellent, how would you rate the care that you've received for your health concerns? And only 3% of people said excellent, which is really staggering. More than half of you here, about almost 60% actually, have said that your care was poor or nearly poor. So that is why we're here today, and to help, just arm everyone with more information to bring to their practitioners. So thank you, Dr. Wasserstein, for that. And it leads into one of the questions that we received, which was a suggestion for questions to ask a GYN to determine if they are sort of sufficiently up to speed on the impact of hormonal fluctuations on women with ADHD. How can we help ourselves find the best people possible for treatment?
Great question. And that reminds me, I want to make a promise to the Attitude community. I'm going to try and pull together, because I've spoken to different people over the course of the year between 2 years, between the last presentation and this one. I'm going to try and compile a list of GYNs who are interested in this topic, as many as I can in different regions, and then I will share that with Attitude Magazine. Getting back, so that would be one way if we had that list, which is not yet created. I think you have to ask the GYN how receptive are you to, how knowledgeable are you about hormone replacement and cognitive problems, and how receptive are you to doing that? There's a lot of GYNs, it's in their literature more than in psychiatry. Their journals have more of this information. So there's a lot of GYNs that are aware of this issue. So I would just ask whoever I'd start with the GYN you use. Hey, do you have any thoughts about hormone replacement and cognitive problems? Are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable learning about that? I'd start there. And then there are menopausal organizations in the GYN community that where the people are specialists in menopause. Subsets of them I must be knowledgeable on the cognitive problems. So if your own person is not willing, I would reach out to whoever the local menopause community is.
Okay. No problem. One common question that we received was your thoughts on whether medications may work differently during different times in the cycle and also during menopause. Someone asked, is it possible that women could require different medications and or dosages at different times in their cycle?
Absolutely. Unequivocally. Without doubt. Problem is, psychiatrists don't know this, or very few psychiatrists know this. On the other hand, APSARD last year, which is an organization devoted to people treating adults with ADD, had a whole seminar devoted to this. So they're becoming more aware of the issue, but they don't know much. They don't know it yet, but they're getting there. So the bottom line answer to your question is absolutely yes. The problem is, will your psychiatrist work with you to make these adjustments?
Right.
Hopefully, yes. That's why I said a collaboration with the GYN and the psychiatrist at some point might make sense. Start with your own treating person.
And you brought up APSARD, and someone here asked today, given this research showing an increase in ADHD diagnoses or symptoms at least during perimenopause, do you think that will have implications for the next version of the DSM? Will there be special considerations on diagnosing women?
No.
We do know that there is work being done to develop the first ever guidelines specifically for adults. We also know that there are not guidelines underway specifically for women.
No, there's no science. I shouldn't say there's no science. There's so very little science, a handful of studies. Eventually, certainly the guidelines were there. I do not see the DSM doing it anytime soon. They haven't done it for other conditions where sex differences are well established. So I don't see them doing it for the DSM-6. Maybe 8 or 9, because the science isn't there. And these guidelines are so based on science and so contentious along the way. I don't see it happening anytime soon. Even lowering the number of symptoms required for the diagnosis of ADHD in adults, there was every indication in the little research that existed that there should be even fewer symptoms required, but getting it lowered as much as they did was a major accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. And a number of people asked about the survey that you cited throughout the presentation today. I will just give a tiny bit of background. This was a survey that was initiated by Attitude as really an editorial survey. We felt that there just wasn't any coverage on the impact of hormones specifically during perimenopause and menopause. And so we fielded a survey to our readers to help us generate some articles. And the insights were so intriguing that we ended up sort of partnering with Dr. Wasserstein and her partners to take a deeper dive, more than our editorial team could do. To date, we have 4,689 responses. And some of you asked about the different things. We could do so much more. We did not go in depth, for example, into mothers versus non-parents in the survey to see if there were any correlation to what a lot of you brought up, considerations of being in the sandwich generation. And I wonder if you could speak to that, Dr. Wasserstein, just all of the other factors that come to bear in our 40s and 50s that may influence the sort of first noticeable onset of ADHD, to say that it's perhaps not hormones alone.
It's definitely not hormone. Well, it is. There's no science to support my statement, but it's just logical. How can it not affect you to have aging parents who you have to take care of, and children who are becoming adolescents, and your own health problems may be beginning to crop up? Of course, all these increased demands during this period has to contribute in many cases. Excuse me. Also, I think it's important to consider the possibility that some of the people who were diagnosed as ADD in this period, really, what I would love to look at is differentiating between those who have a family history of ADHD and therefore are more likely to come from the genetic cluster, people who have ADHD with a genetic predisposition, versus those who don't come from a family where there is no history of ADHD and for whom this shift may be almost entirely hormonally induced. So there's the question of vulnerability, genetically differential, and there's the question of environmental stressors that might be differential. And then you can look at which environmental stressors are more likely to cause the problem, is taking care of aging parents, or having a spouse suffering from dementia, early dementia, or having adolescent children, or having children leaving your home. You could look at all of those things and see to what extent they may or may not contribute differentially to developing symptoms that look like ADHD or worsen ADHD that was definitely there to begin with.
Mm-hmm. No,
good question. Very, very complicated.
Very. No shortage of future research opportunities. And maybe it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it, that yes, like for women in their 40s and 50s, ADHD at the time that we grew up was considered a little boy's condition. So many of these women had symptoms that did appear before age 7 that were just never picked up on. We know that.
Yeah, they also had the inattentive type, so they, more often as not, so they were ignored because they were just quiet and they were not what's called disruptive. ADHD back then was considered a disruptive condition. Now it's called a neurodevelopmental condition, in allowing in more girls. But when it was disruptive, it was skewed towards disruptive behavior, which tended to happen more in impulsive hyperkinetic children who more often as not were boys.
Absolutely. So a lot of our talk today was perimenopause and menopause, but could you speak a little bit to what we know about the increased prevalence, if any, of postpartum depression and PMDD on women with ADHD?
Very little is known. It's mainly anecdotal. I would have reported it. I mean, I looked at the literature. So to my knowledge, it's mainly anecdotal that women with ADHD are more likely to have problems with postpartum depression and the increase of their symptoms. And that follows because the estrogen is dropping off during that period. And they're more likely to have premenstrual problems. Again, they may have a bigger sensitivity to the hormonal fluctuations and the drop-off of estrogen in that period. Remember the genetics that I talked about. There's evidence, at least among animals, that the estrogen receptors may differ. Those creatures that have some estrogen receptors may be more predisposed to hyperactive and impulsive behavior. What that means is that if your receptors are reacting differently to the minimal amount of estrogen or the decreasing amount of estrogen, that makes you more likely to become symptomatic during periods when the estrogen drops off. So premenstrually and postpartumly fits in there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. We've at Attitude, we've seen, just a few pieces of research coming out within the last 2.5 years, linking higher rates of PMDD to women with ADHD. But again, this is sort of the tip of the iceberg. So it's all a little unsatisfying. I understand that, but we're aiming to be part of this conversation and really pressure the research community to do more. So
please.
Thank you for helping us and doing that.
Yeah, please. I didn't see those studies. I would love to see them. All I know is that there's so little out there, and the way things make an impact in the research community. And the research community matters because they have an impact on the treating community. Anyway, so the way that things have an impact on the research community is when there's what's called converging evidence. You got to have it coming from lots of studies, from lots of places, because there's lots of journals out there and people don't read all the journals. So if it's published in one journal and only one article, the likelihood that it's going to be known by the larger community is decreased greatly. And then it depends on which journal. Some journals have what's called a higher impact factor, meaning that more people read them. So I didn't find those articles, for example, and I was looking. So I would definitely welcome finding out about them.
Amazing. Yeah.
Other questions?
I'll just make a note. We will gather together a link to Dr. Wasserstein's first Attitude webinar on this topic of specifically menopause and ADHD, and as well as the articles that Attitude has published on our research findings and some of the other news pieces that we have on PMDD and postpartum depression. We'll gather all those together in sort of the post-webinar resources so that you all have those links. I think I may know the answer to this, but it was an interesting question whether there's been any research on or your thoughts on the interplay between dopamine, which we know so impacts ADHD symptoms, and estrogen.
Well, estrogen is a dopamine modulator. And estrogen increases the availability of dopamine. So that's definitely one of the mechanisms of the action of estrogen on ADHD symptoms, because we know dopamine is an important neurotransmitter for ADHD.
Right.
And so, yes, definitely.
Okay. A lot of people asking if you could go back to your comments regarding hormone replacement therapy, and you spoke of an ideal window. Could you explain that a little further, the sort of ideal window for using the HRT and the benefits or drawbacks of,
Great question. I first became aware of this critical window when I first became interested in estrogen and cognition about 10 years ago. And there was mainly animal research at the time. And in the animal research, they talked about this critical window. I'm drawing attention to this because the animal research is not irrelevant. It's actually the early stages of many things. Anyway, they reported a critical window in animal research during which, if the animal was younger, adding estrogen or giving the animal estrogen replacement was helpful for neuronal health. But if the animal was older and had been without estrogen longer, if you introduced estrogen, it caused tissue death. So that meant from the animal research that there might be a critical window. We didn't know from the animal research if the critical window idea applied to humans. Since then, there's been evidence with humans that there is a similar critical window. And basically, I don't think they've delineated how long that critical window is. Basically, it's got to be you have to introduce the hormone supplementation during the perimenopausal period, and then you can extend it longer. But the introduction has to be early on, or certainly not long after menopause. I don't think they've established the boundaries yet. So the earlier you introduce the hormone supplementation, if you go that path, the better. That's another reason why that Women's Health Initiative study was so bad. They were using women who had been menopausal many years. They introduced hormone replacement with horse estrogen and fake progesterone in women who had been menopausal for many years. There's so many problems with that study. And so many people say, just don't listen to it. So the critical window seems to be around perimenopause or very early menopause. And if you are well into menopause, don't do it. It's dangerous. Does that answer that question, I hope?
I'm sure there will be more, but thank you very much.
Yeah.
I did want to there was a question that I think gets to the real crux here today. And that is, someone asks, how can symptoms of perimenopause be teased out from symptoms of ADHD at the risk of mis or overdiagnosing ADHD?
Excellent. I mean, in our data, I'm saying attitude, it's our joint data. We don't know, and that's another question that we would like to ask in follow-up work. We don't know which of those women who were first diagnosed during those years, which of them had already been ADHD and it just got worse, versus women who were not ADHD or not genetically predisposed to ADHD, and they just developed a phenotype, a medical mimic that looks like ADHD, and they even respond to the medications in the same way, but it's not ADHD in the sense of being the genetic type. And then among the women who definitively were diagnosed with ADHD or thought they had ADHD when they were younger, and they have a bunch of ADHD kids or relatives, so they're likely to have the genetic vulnerability. We cannot tease apart at this point which of their symptoms are a worsening or a presentation of ADHD versus which of those symptoms are purely related to menopause. Can't tease that apart. We don't know enough. Mm-hmm. I mean, the research that we did jointly with Attitude is, to our knowledge, the first that's looked at it, period.
There's a lot of work that remains to be done. And a lot of people here asking, are you planning to continue this line of research? Will there be more studies? A lot of very willing participants here today who are hopeful that this is just the beginning.
I hope it's just the beginning. It's my intention.
Wonderful.
I feel this is a woman's health issue. We are 50% of the world. Whether it's ADHD or perimenopause or ADHD and perimenopause, doesn't matter. We're half the world. And this is a significant issue, and it should be recognized and addressed.
Absolutely. We're with you on that. And we hope that today was a step in the right direction. We couldn't get to everyone's questions. We received almost 400, but that's a lot of ideas for things to ask about in further research and follow-up materials as well. So we hope that those of you who attended will continue looking for that, and we'll keep the conversation going. I will mention that we've started something new in our Facebook group for adults. We've pinned a conversation for those of you who are attending today to continue discussing what you learned today, to ask questions, to share. And we hope that you will use that space to exactly keep the momentum going. And so that our end goal is more research and greater understanding. So in the meantime, Dr. Wasserstein, thank you so much for today's webinar and for contributing your voice to the ADHD community. And thank you everyone who attended as well. We hope you know that we have free webinars every week. We will be announcing a February webinar specifically about the sandwich generation and the stresses on adults who have both aging parents and children with ADHD. So look out for that one. You will get a notification if you sign up at attitudemag.com/newsletters. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, you're going to visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast 484 to access the webinar resources. You can also click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. And if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Right now, we have a special holiday 2-for-1 offer. You can get a subscription for yourself and another one for free for someone who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. All right, for now, thank you again, Dr. Wasserstein, and thanks everyone for joining us.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.